Hi, this is Leonard from Cosmic Sound and welcome to another video from our high-tech department. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite things at the moment, and that is the new Maschine Studio. Now, there's some very exciting things going on here. Obviously you'll see that the controller is totally new, but what is even more impressive is what's going on under the hood, and by that I mean the new Maschine 2 software. So we're going to talk a bit about that. We're also going to go right through all the features on the controller, so let's not waste any time and we'll get straight into it. So here we have the Maschine 2 controller. I'll just show you compared to one of the old Maschine controllers. It's quite a bit bigger, as you can see. Definitely really good thing to have in the studio. Probably be pretty good on stage as well, as the screens are much bigger, but definitely not as portable as the original one. So let's run through some of the features of the new controller. There's some pretty obvious things, of course. It is much bigger. We have got these really nice color LCD displays here now as well, which are absolutely fantastic, and they make your life a lot easier. We'll just run through some of the sections we've got on here. So the top panel here, you'll see the familiar 8 knobs that we had on the original Maschine controllers. Some of this stuff here is similar as well. We've got a few new buttons on here, which I'll show you what they do as well. Over here we have now got this metering section. We've got some other things here which can change the focus for what this knob can control. The bottom section here, of course, you've got your 16 pads, exactly the same as before. We've got some new things over here, or they're more importantly been reorganized. They're not exactly new features, but now we have a separate dedicated section for them, and they make things a lot easier, especially when you're performing, hence the name performance. So in this section we've got a tap tempo, we've got step mode, which used to be controlled from a button on the top here. This jumps into your macros as well, which I'll come into later as well, and your note repeat, which was a separate button on the Maschine controller before, so not much different there. We've got our 8 groups down here as well, transport controls down the bottom here, a couple of new things on here, but nothing really major. All our controls down here as well are pretty much exactly the same. They just look a bit different here when we view them on the screen. This section over here is more or less completely new. This is the edit section. So the buttons you'll see here are not actually new features, but they are new buttons. These used to be shift features and they were written over the actual pad, so you used to hit shift in a particular pad. But now we actually have dedicated buttons for those things, which is really nice. We've got this jog wheel down here as well, which is basically used primarily for scrubbing through the track. We have these different sort of titles here as well that we can, once they're illuminated, that'll actually change the function of the jog wheel. So the first thing I want to do is just take you through the new software and show you what's changed from the first version. So as you'll see here, this is the Maschine 2 software. It looks quite a bit different to the first version. We'll just run through it piece by piece. First of all, we have got the browser panel on the left here. There's some pretty big changes in here, but generally speaking, it's a lot easier to find what you're looking for. On the very right here, this is pretty important. So the little NI logo here is basically telling you that right now we're looking at everything from the built-in library, and that includes things from Complete and your expansion packs. If I jump over to the little person here, that is my user library, which I'll come to a little bit later when I show you how to use samples. We'll go back to the native instruments library and we'll just take a look at the different things along the top here. So first of all, we've got projects. If we go over here, these are all groups, so they're generally drum kits or any sort of sound that uses multiple pads. We go to sounds here. Basically, these are a few different things. Generally what they are either an instrument or a sample that may be saved with a set of effects or any particular tweaks that you may have made. So next, if I move over to the next tab, we have got instruments. And generally what these are pretty much always pitched instruments, so something that you may want to play with more than one note. It applies to all of the things I've shown you already, but we'll just get into one little detail here which is pretty important in the new interface. So you'll see it says all instruments right here. If I tap this little down arrow, it's going to actually show me a list of all the native instruments products I have that contain instruments or things that I can use as an instrument. So you'll see that's the Maschine one there, which contains all the stock instruments. So when I click that, you'll now see all the instruments. I can get rid of that. I can go back in. I can choose something like absinthe as well, and it'll show me all my absinthe patches. So that's pretty much instruments. We'll move over to the next one. We've got effects in here, and again, it's very similar. So we've got lots of different types of effects. If I drop the little arrow down here, you'll see I've got my standard Maschine effects, and all my effects from Complete are listed in here as well. So I can use pretty much any native instruments product to create an effect, and that'll be loaded on top of a sound that is already selected. I'll move over to samples now. So this is the majority of your Maschine library is contained in here. This is where all your drum samples will live, all your one-shot samples as well, loops as well, if you happen to use those as well. Same deal as well, I can drop this down, and what this is going to show me now is my Maschine library here, and also these are all the expansion packs that I own, so I've got all those in there as well. Makes it a bit easier when I'm looking for samples. I don't have to go through every single one. I can actually pick out individual sample packs that I might want to find samples in. This is probably a pretty good time to show you the user library section as well. So again, we've got this little Native Instruments logo here. The next one over is the user library. I've got heaps of samples in my user library, so I'll tick over to that. And you'll see there that I've got all my samples that I've loaded into my Maschine library. While we're over here, let's just take a look at this next section down here. So this has changed considerably from the old Maschine setup, which had different columns, and as you'd move through levels, you'd move into a different column. Now what we have is this kind of list of different things that then moves out into the next list and then into a third list, or however many you need to have. So example here, I've got drums selected. I could actually set this to anything else, and you'll see that the next section here, everything changes. So we'll stick with drums. Let's take an example. If I go into, let's pick kicks, for example. So I'll go into kicks, and you'll now see that I open up another list here that I can actually further refine my searches. So let's say I want to click on, let's have all my electronic kicks. So now it shows me all of that stuff here. I could just search for 808 kicks, and that shows me all my 808 kicks. So we've looked at the browser. I'm going to move over here into the group area here. So it's a little bit different to the first version. Looks mostly the same, but you'll notice here, instead of having all the groups listed, I've now just got one group, and I've got this plus button. So as you can see here, I can just keep adding groups as before. So I can go up to H. There you go. So that's the 8 groups. What's really cool about this new software is I'm not actually limited to 8 groups anymore. I can have as many groups as I want, as long as they're grouped in banks of 8. So you'll see I'm up to H1. If I hit plus again, I'll go down to A2, and I can just keep adding as many groups as I want to. Other than that, this section's not terribly different. So we move down here, we've got some control elements here. Similar to the version 1 software, I can choose between master, group, and sound. So that means I can pretty much change anything I want to within those parameters. To show you this, all I really need to do is load a sample, so I'll just do that from the software here. So now what we'll see is I've got some different things I can adjust. So I've got groove here, which is what it defaults to. I can change the swing of this sound independently. I can also change that for the group and the master. I've got some settings here for input as well. That'd be more if you were doing sampling. Same sort of thing for output. Given that I'm on a sound here, I can actually send that, the default would be to send that out to the group, which will then be sent to the master. But there are some other things that I can choose from as well. So I can send the sound straight to the master. I can actually send it to any number of different external outputs as well. We've also got cue here, which is most important for live performance, so that you can actually cue a sound without it getting sent to the master before you load it, to know whether you're going to want to load that sound or move on to another one. All our basic settings here as well in terms of level and pan. If I move over to auxiliary, this is pretty interesting as well. So what I can do here is I can set up different auxiliaries and send this sound to anywhere else that I might want. So that might be different pads in another group which I'm using to set up effects chains. Again, I can send an amount of the sound to any external output or to the master or anywhere else. So that's the basic audio settings for the sound. So if we move over to the left-hand side of this area, you'll see here I've got a couple of other options as well. What they've done is divide this into audio settings and then into plugin settings. So if I jump over here, you'll see plugin, and this is now all the settings I can apply to my sample or whatever I happen to have loaded into a sound slot. So because I've got a sample loaded here, we'll see a whole bunch of settings that are related to samples. This is all very similar. I probably don't need to go into this too much. Basic tuning settings here. I can choose what type of sample I want, so I can set this to ADSR. I can go over here to effects, so this is pretty good. You've got compression, sample rate reduction, drive, bit reduction as well without having to load any plugins. Modulation through an envelope here, so I've got the envelope. I can use that to control any of these different settings here, different destinations. Same with LFO, I can set up an LFO and send that to any destination. And of course the same deal with the mod wheel as well. So that's pretty much all the settings for a sound. So something a little bit different to the old software is there used to be these tabs along the top which could allow me to add an extra 3 elements. What I can do now is actually have any number of different things added to it. So you'll notice over here, we've got this little window here that shows me the sampler. If I drop down that, you'll see all the other things that I might be able to load into a slot, into a sampler slot. So I could replace that with, for example, a drum synth, which is another new feature of the software. I could replace it with anything from Complete, or I can put more effects there as well. So what I can do now, instead of just being able to load 3 extra things, I can actually have as many as I want. And again, using the little plus sign, I can add things here. So let's say I wanted to add, for example, a beat delay. I can add that. Let's say I now want to add a phaser. I can add that. Let's say I now want to have a compressor. I can just keep adding as many things as I want. I'm actually not limited by any number of slots. Same goes on group, same goes on master. You can add as many different things as you want. So other than that, everything's pretty similar in here. You can see I've still got a limited amount of 16 sounds that I can have per group. We've just got a couple of extra little things here that I can do. I've got this thing here which I can drop down. It shows me all the sounds loaded in this group, which is only 1 at the moment. It also makes it much easier to choke sounds than in the first version. So we've got choke groups here. I can set that to 1. If I had a second sound over here, I can also set that to 1. So the other thing that's a pretty major addition, this is actually quite huge. We've got this little button up here, which I can change, and that puts me into the mixer view. This is completely new to Maschine. It makes things a lot easier to get around. It makes it much more of a modular setup and much more graphical and easy to figure out what's happening with what you've got loaded. So here we are. So this is the mixer here. I'm in group A, so I'll jump over to that. I can search through all my different groups. I'll jump back over to the one where I've loaded a sample, and then you go. So we've got the 16 sounds that are loaded within this group. Of course, I can actually see the group fader over here as well. If you're familiar with using any DAW, this is a pretty familiar setup. So I've got level control here. I can mute the sounds. I can solo them. I can do lots of different things from here. Most importantly, what I get when I actually play back a pattern is I'll get a visual representation of my level. So I'll just show you that very quickly. I'll just jump back over here and we'll just add in some sounds here. And when I jump back to this section, we'll just get this playing. You'll see now I've got some metering showing me my levels, which is pretty awesome, which we didn't have before. So other things we can do here, it's very easy for us to route to different things. So I can send to my external outputs again. I can send it to my master. I can do all kinds of different things. I've also got I/O settings here, so again that's for my inputs and my MIDI. Go back there. This now shows me all the plugins that I've got loaded on this track, which is really good, and more auxiliaries as well, so I can send things to different areas. Basically, I mean, it said the major advantage of this is much more graphical representation than the previous software offered, so it really makes it a lot easier to jump in here and change things without having to move through menus or deal with anything that you don't want to deal with. Down right below that, you'll see that I now have a graphical representation of all the different things I have loaded on the channel. So right here, I've got my beat delay, I've got my phaser and my compressor that I added before, so I can actually see all the different knobs and things that I might want to change on there. I can also jump back to the sampler, which is pretty awesome. You can see all the different features of your sampler without having to jump into the sampler window like you used to have to with the original software. So I can see my sample here. I've got zones here as well if I want to map things across the keyboard. I've got all my parameters here that I can adjust. I've got graphical representations of my filter, of my amp envelope as well, so it makes things a lot easier to move through. I can change my endpoint of my sample very easily. I've got my start point here. I've got my loop settings down here. My voice and engine again, so here's that S1200 setting as well. I can choose all those things. So one other thing that's been really exciting with this software has been the addition of sidechaining capability. You can do a lot of different things with this. I'll just show you just the standard way of using it. So I've got my kick drum track here, and I'll add a synthesizer to another sound here. So it's that one. This is actually coming from Massive, this sound, and I'll just do something very simple. Just add one long note here. There we go. So if I play that back, you'll hear I've just got my kick and my one long synth sound. So what I'm going to do now here is to the track with Massive on it, I'm going to go and add a compressor. There it is. So I've now got my compressed sound, but obviously it is not rhythmic. So I just need to move over to the sidechain input section here and just select the sound that I want to trigger the sidechain compressor. And And there we go, and instantly I've got my pumping sound there. So you can obviously use this in lots of different ways. This one's probably the most standard way, but of course this is pretty good, and it's a really good thing to have inside Maschine. So now we're going to get into looking at the new Maschine Studio controller. But just before I do that, just a couple of extra points to mention about the Maschine 2 software. Most importantly, it is totally compatible with any of the original controllers, so that is the Mark 1 or the Mark 2, and of course either of the Maschine microcontrollers as well. So if you have one of these old controllers and you want to get the new software, that is totally possible. Just jump straight onto the Native Instruments website and buy it. It's a download, comes with a new library as well. It's quite expanded from the first version. You won't lose anything from your first library though, so definitely recommend it. It's very much worth upgrading to the new software. So let's get straight into the new controller now. I'll show you a bit about how this all works now, and now that I've showed you the Maschine software, which is probably the most important part to understand, some of these things should make more sense. So let's get into doing something really simple. We're going to load a sound. So if I jump into Browse, you'll notice instantly this is completely different from what we had on the old browser. At the top here now we've got the some choices that we can jump through. So I've got my samples here, I've got my effects, I've got my instruments, sounds, groups, projects. So they're all things that were familiar from the first version of the software, but they're actually just organized a little bit differently. So right now you'll see this all products thing is floating above this second knob. So that means if I turn that, I will jump through all the different things that I've got in here. So let's just go to the stock Maschine library. You'll now see down here I've got all banks. So I can turn that, and it's going to show me all the different libraries that I've got installed here. So this is the Maschine 1.8 library. Here's the new Maschine 2 library and the new sounds that come with that. I can then also jump into sub-banks as well. And you'll now see that the right screen has given us a number of options. First of all, it's showing me here that I'm in the stock Maschine library. This is all now very similar to what we had in the original software. So I'm on instruments at the moment. I could then pick a subgroup of instrument. So let's just do that. Let's say bass, and it's given me 4 options here that I can choose from. So I can use this knob here, which I can move up and down, and I can choose a sound by hitting load. You'll now see that's now loaded onto a pad down here, and I can trigger that by pressing the pad. So let's just do something similar. Now we're going to move out of sounds. I'm going to go up to samples. There we go. So this is most commonly what you'd be doing. So here, for example, let's do something a bit different. We'll go to an expansion pack. Let's pick one there. So I don't get any more options on here now. I need to go over to this other screen here. It's showing me my different options for what samples I can load. I've got drums and I've got one-shots. We'll just stick with a drum for the moment. Let's say we want to get a clap. So not only do I have a choice of just choosing my claps that came with this expansion pack, I've also got some other choices here, so I can add subtypes here. I've got my analog, snap, all different kinds of things in here. We'll stick with an analog one here. So here we go again, and you'll notice we have this pre-hear thing as well. So as I move down, it's actually playing the sound to me. You can turn that off if you don't want to do that. So, but it is actually pretty handy when you're searching for a sound. So I can hit load. There we go, I've got the sound loaded here. So that's pretty simple. That's just how we load a sound. So there's some other things we can do as well. So now you'll see this really comes into its own having these screens. So I have a visual representation of what's happening there. I've got a sampler, I can see the sample. It makes things way easier to figure what's going on, and I don't really have to look at the screen for this, my computer screen that is. So here's all the settings I showed you before. We've got the polyphony, the pitch bend, I've got my sampler mode here as well. This is where we can do a few different things as well with the controller. So if I want to change my channel settings, I jump over here. Again, I showed you all this in the software before. I can very simply move through my different settings here. I've got this up the top here, so I can move through there if I want to change my groove or send my output to somewhere else. That's all contained in there. And again, very simply, I can move through my group and my master as well if I need to change that. Same thing if I go back to my plugin. I can go to my group here. I can add any effects that I might want to add, and the same on my master. So very, very simple. Let's say we wanted to add an effect now. So all I need to do is up on the right screen here, you'll see it says sampler. I'm just going to move across and I'm going to create an empty slot like that. So what I'm going to do now, I can either press browse to get straight in here and search through effects. Another way I can do this is to hit shift browse, and it will take me straight into the effects built into Maschine. So let's say I want to add a delay. There we go, we've got beat delay here, or let's choose a grain delay because that's always good fun. So I can load that here. So you'll instantly see I've loaded a grain delay there. So really good, we've got a graphical representation. I know exactly what's happening with my chain here. So let's say I want to add another thing on here as well. What I can do, I'll have to jump back out of my browser. I can select a new slot. Let's go in again. Let's go in a different way this time. We'll go back to the normal browser. So this, of course, is you'll get a lot more things in here because it's actually showing up all the effects that I have in my native instruments libraries as well. So again, we can search here. This is pretty cool. So I can search through. I've got some basic categories here. We've got studio effects. We've got creative effects, which are obviously going to be a bit strange. Let's go with a creative effect. So now I've got that selected. I'm going to move in and choose a product here. Let's go with let's just go with absinthe. I can move here. I've got my banks. So this is going to show me all the different banks. And it's exactly what would show up inside absinthe if I had that loaded. So we'll go to my 5 bank, and now we can make some choices over on the right screen. So these are all the different effects I might be able to have. So what's in there? Let's choose a reverb. So I've got 3 choices here I can pick. Load a reverb. So let's back out. Here we go. So now I've got 3 things loaded on this sample slot, and you'll see them on here, but I also have all my controls here, which is really nice as well. So these are all the different parameters I can adjust from within the Absinthe software. So I've got 3 pages of them. So if I want to do something with one of the other things I've got loaded here, all I need to do is move my selection. I can go to my grain delay. I now have all my parameters that I can adjust there. Of course, I have 2 pages there as well. Or indeed, I can go back to my sampler and adjust all the things that I might need in there. So let's jump into the arrange page here. So you'll see instantly how handy this is. It means I don't have to look at the screen for anything. I can see exactly what's going on with the things that I'm programming. I'll just do a really quick example here. Let's jump into step mode and let's say, well, this was a clap. We'd put that probably on 2 and 4 as an example. What you can see over here is the grander picture of what's happening. So this will actually show me all the sounds that I'm programming. And then over here on this screen, what we've got is a more detailed view of this particular sound. So it's showing me what I've added here. It's also showing me the velocities of each sound here. Of course, I've got fixed velocity on at the moment, so if I take that off, you'll actually see that we get some different velocities depending on how hard I am hitting the pads. So let's move over to mix. Of course, this is what we saw in the software. So we've got the full mixer here that we can see. I've got some levels that I can adjust, which is very handy. I can change between the different sounds, which will change the focus and obviously adjust the different things that I can do here. So we'll jump into the next section. We've got sampling here. So of course, this is pretty similar to what we had on the original software. The major difference being when we view it on this controller, we have a much better understanding of what's happening. So you can see my waveform here. I've got the same choices that I had in the original software. I can use this for slicing loops. I've got my zone here as well, so I can load in different samples and map these across a keyboard. So I'll give you a very brief overview of what's happening in here. Again, we'll take up a lot of time if we show you everything that's going on here. So let's just take a look at what these are doing. So we've got the mute. So similar again to the Maschine 1, it's just much more graphical and much easier to figure out what's going on. The same with solo, that's exactly the same. So I can jump into my select area. This is where I can just pick which things I want to select so that I can adjust different things on them. Duplicate, of course, I can very easily select a pad, select a set place to copy it, a duplicate of what I had there before. Navigate, very easy to move through the different things that we've got here. You can see that I can move between the different sections of my sampler very easily from here. Pad mode, of course, this one's very important. So here we can go into, let's just latch that so I can keep it on there. We've got our keyboard mode, which you'll see immediately the software changes. And I can now, obviously this is not the best sound to do that with, but I can pitch things. I can change the velocities here, so I've got a choice of 16 velocities, limiting them rather than having the whole 127 options. And of course, I can have fixed velocity here as well. So a couple of other things we can adjust. Over here, you'll see which notes are being played on each pad, and I can change that. I've got octave shift, I've got semitone shift, so I can basically have this in any arrangement that I might want. So the other thing I can do from pad mode, which is not limited to the keyboard mode at all, I have my choke groups in here as well, which are located in a slightly different place to where they were in the first version of the software. So pretty simply I can have set each of these sounds to the same choke group. And then when I play one, if I press the second one, it'll actually stop the first one from playing. So that's pad mode. We can get out of that. We've got pattern mode here as well, which is pretty much for selecting your patterns. You can also change your pattern length here, which is again a very important thing, especially if you're out playing live and you need to do this quickly. It's very easy to adjust there. And then finally at the top I've got my scene settings where I can change, select different scenes. As you can see there, I can change a couple of other settings in here as well. Let's have a look at some of the other sections on the controller. We've got the performance section over here. The tap obviously is a tap tempo. Step mode, I showed you very briefly before. It's a lot better to look at than when we did this in the first version of the software. So I'm going to move into macro mode, and you'll see what happens is we switch into the channel view that I showed you before. We now have these potential 8 knobs here to control anything from within the software. Now we've got different levels of this as well. So each sound, of course, will have 8. We can do that with the group as well and the master. So this can control anything from basically any of the plugins or anything happening on the particular sound. If I move into group, we can actually use those to control anything from within the group settings or the things per sound. And on the master, we can use that to control absolutely anything in the entire project. So let's stick with sound for now. So we've got, at the moment, you'll see them just labeled 1 to 8. There's nothing assigned to them. If I move over into the software, and I'm going to drop down this little thing here, we get this extra menu here. So I've got a choice of automation and pages. So what I can do from here, I can select, and I'm going to choose the sampler. And you'll see here that we're moving across, and it's giving me different options as we move through. So let's say I wanted to automate the tune knob. So I'd go into pitch, and now I'll choose tune. And you'll see it then in the software, it's then been assigned. I can label this if I want to, or write anything in there that I might want. And you'll see now that if I just get this, I've got tuning control over that, and of course I can assign anything to any of these that I want. So that's pretty much macro controls. The only other thing we've got in this section is note repeat, which is exactly the same as it was in the first version of the software. What we can do here, so we can change the value of this. So if I just get this playing, so if I have note repeat, you'll hear there that I get some extra notes worth 16ths. Let's do this, let's record this as well so you can actually see what it does. So you'll now see if I move back to my arrange page, there you go, you'll see the effect of the note repeat. So down here, there's not a lot happening that's new. We've got some basic transport controls here. There's your metronome. So we've also got events here. I can jump in there and I can basically just select different events. I can move up and down the different sounds that I have in my group. Once I've found the one that I want, I can either select all. If I wanted to select everything there, I can select none. Or I have an option over here that I can move to confirm a certain selection. You can see there that I can control where I want this to start and where I want it to finish. So that's that. We also have in here grid as well, so we can choose the size of the grid, which is very handy when you want to start changing up the rhythm somewhat, especially if you're introducing triplets and things. Down the bottom here, this of course is all very familiar. The all-important shift button, of course, doesn't do quite as much as it did in the original version of Maschine, because of course we had all these things that were written over the pads. But you'll still see things here, so we've got choke on this one. If you look over here onto the edit section, we've got some different things that we can do there with the shift feature as well, which I'll show you a couple of those now as well. So what I'm going to do is just record something pretty bad, just to show you what we can do with the edit features over here. So we'll get that going, got my metronome going. So you can see I'm pretty much out of time there. So what I'm going to do now is just hit quantize, and there you go. So I've instantly done that. I can undo this, so another use for here, we've got undo. So I'll send that back to how it was before, which is again terrible. And what I'm going to do now is a 50% quantize, which is actually probably my favorite setting to use with this, because it actually retains a little bit of the human feel. It doesn't gridlock it. So I'm going to do that. You'll see there's a little bit of a problem over here on my screen where this kick actually hasn't been pushed onto the first beat well enough. But in terms of how it sounds, you can appreciate what this does. So a couple of other things on here. I can do things, if I get back out of here and go back to my arrange page. Let's say, for example, I had a sound on here. Again, there's no particularly great examples in the drum kit, but let's say I went to pad mode, keyboard mode. So now what you can see is I've actually got, basically what this is doing is playing a note. If I was to hold down note and move my jog wheel here, you will see that I can actually move that note up and down, thereby changing the pitch. So quite useful, especially if you were playing in a keyboard part, for example, and one of the notes was in the wrong spot, you can do this. Of course, you can all do this very easily in the software as well, but the beauty of this controller is it means that you very rarely actually have to go to the computer if you don't want to. Everything can be done from the controller, and much more effectively than it could be done with the original Maschine controllers. So other than that, there's not a lot else happening on here. We've got nudge as well, so if I was to, what I'm going to do is do a selection. We'll get back out of keyboard mode, go back straight into there. Let's pick a different sound. So I've got that one selected now. I'm going to go to my events, and I'm going to make sure that my focus is in the right spot. So this is the channel I want to affect. And what I'm going to do now is just select a couple of those notes. And what I can now do is nudge anything that is actually currently selected by just holding down nudge and using the jog wheel there. So that's a few of the features the jog wheel can be used for. It can actually be used a lot more than what I've shown you as well. It just means that it can take over from other dedicated knobs. For example, if I'm in the browse screen, I can use it for browsing, depending which section is highlighted at the time. So very useful. It can be used for all sorts of things. Most commonly, it's used to scrub through the different patterns that you might have. Just another thing to mention with this, of course, this entire controller is MIDI mappable as well. You can very easily put it into MIDI mode like so, and then you of course have all these different things that you can map to anything within your software. And definitely for me, this scrub wheel can be very useful as an actual scrub wheel for your software as well. So just before we finish, I'm just going to take you through a couple of physical features on this controller that are a bit different to the previous versions. So of course, as I mentioned, it's a lot bigger, but you also get some extra options on here which make it definitely worthwhile getting. So on the back here, you'll notice here we've got now 4 MIDI outs. So, 3 MIDI outs and 1 MIDI in that we can use for controlling anything we might want to. We've also, of course, got 2 foot switch controllers here as well, which can be very useful for triggering things. The big difference as well is that this one's actually powered as well, so you will need to actually connect it to mains power. And probably my favorite little addition is this stand on the back, which means you don't need to buy any other stands, you don't need to prop it up on anything else or put it on a laptop stand or anything. It's all built into it, which is, for me, very, very worthwhile. So we've been looking at the new Maschine 2 software and of course the Maschine Studio controller, or brand new from Native Instruments. I haven't been able to go into absolutely everything that goes on with the software and the controller, unfortunately, because there's just way too much. It's an extremely, extremely powerful tool. So fantastic for producers in the studio, definitely a worthy tool for performing live as well. Major additions, the screens, everything on here makes this an absolutely fantastic product from Native Instruments, and I can't speak highly enough of it. So if you want any more information on this, please come in and see us at our Osborne Park or Cannington branches, or please check us out online at cosmic.com.au.